Good evening. Welcome to the final talk of our 2020-2021 Bracken Lecture Series, named for John R. Bracken, a key part of Penn State landscape architecture history, one of the earliest graduates from the undergraduate program, and a longtime valued professor in the program. The lecture series started in 1982 and is made possible by a generous endowment from Bracken's estate. Tonight, we're really excited to welcome Walter Meyer from local office, Landscape and Urbanism. I met Walter in 2016 for the first time through a colleague at Michael Van Valkenburg Associates, and was brought there to enjoy kind of a gathering of like-minded people in his studio in Gowanus, I believe. You can correct me on that, Gowanus, Brooklyn. And I was, I guess, sort of based on the name and the small space and the funky atmosphere, I was expecting a sort of modest operation, and I was just completely blown away by the scale and ambition of the work. And this focus on resiliency that he was taking on with his colleagues at that time, dealing with post-Sandy at both huge scales and at really, really interesting small scales. So I don't want to talk too much about his work specifically, because he's here to do that for us. But I am very, very excited to hear more about how the firm has progressed since that time. And I'll pass it on to one of our student leaders, Grace McNeil, in a moment. But first I want to thank Department Head Eliza Pennypacker, Andy Cole, Interim Head of Landscape Architecture, Patricia Cooker, Interim Director of Stuckeman School, Stephen Carpenter, Dean of College of Arts and Architecture. I should say Eliza Pennypacker was department head when we agreed to have Walter come on, and he's been great about being very flexible. He was originally supposed to come last year, so it's been a long time waiting for this lecture, and we're really excited. Finally, to the staff at Marketing Communications, Pam Wirtz, and the folks at WPSU for helping to set up this online format. So Grace will tell you a little bit more about our speaker, and then we will hand it off to Walter.
At a time when climate resilience projects are being planned and constructed, Walter Meyer's built works at the scale of the neighborhood, city, and bioregion are some examples that have withstood the planet's most severe forces. The performance metrics from his built projects have shaped local and national policy. In 2013, Meyer was recognized by the White House as a champion of change for his work using alternate energy as a means of immediate relief and an engine for long-term economic recovery after Superstorm Sandy. He served in as advisor to then President Barack Obama's team until 2016. As a firm, Local Office has garnered accolades from across the disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, public policy, science, and art. Its redesign for the Miracle Mile district in Miami to protect small businesses from flooding was documented by the New York Times and the New Yorker. Meyer's landscape-led city-making approach is currently being implemented in state resiliency plans for New Jersey and Mississippi, and he is designing New York City's first climate-proof fossil fuel-free neighborhood named Arverne East in Rockaway Beach. Meyer is also the executive director of Coastal Marine Resource Center, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the conservation of the New York-New Jersey harbor bight, and he currently teaches at the Parsons School of Design. Meyer earned his Master of Landscape Architecture in Urban Design at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and a Bachelor of Landscape Architecture from University of Florida. Please welcome Walter Meyer.
Thank you for that, Grace, and Alec. Thank you for the introduction, and amazing to be with you years later after 2016. I'm going to go ahead and share a screen for the presentation. Okay. So a bit about myself. You know, my ancestors in Colombia, they come from the Muisca tribe in Chía, outside of Bogota. And Chía was a indigenous trading outpost for the Spanish colonists. And you know, the thinking and the center of that culture was building on the accumulation of human experience over time. So I'm sort of thinking about, you know, the cellular memory for me is thinking about city making in terms of conveying ideas, conveying power that comes from human power systems as well as natural power systems, and kind of, you know, standing on the shoulders of the generations before us, to kind of think about landscape as this kind of horizontal medium, that what I found now more than ever is having its moment, its global moment. You know, our small little profession of landscape architecture was largely insular, and was described going back to the Olmsted days, you know, as a generalist profession, which I think was an important description that carried it through the centuries. But I think now that it's scaled up to addressing planetary scale issues of climate change, we need you know, an additional parlance to give it its presence that it's currently stepping into, and it needs, you know, some more tools. And I struggle with finding tools in the English language to describe what landscape can do. For lack of a better term, it's landscape thought or landscape thinking, similar to how architecture had a design thinking moment a decade ago. I hear over and over that in our work, you know, sometimes we'll work with celebrities designing private residence for them. And they'll tell me, I didn't know what landscape architecture was until I met you, Walter, and you know, people know the design stars, but they don't know the profession, right? And so how do we reconcile that as a profession? And in some ways, our work is outpacing the profession itself, and there needs to be kind of repositioning of the profession and how it sits in the world, in the mainstream, in culture making, because, you know, there's some big shoes that we've had to step into lately since the last generation of landscape architects. And one of the many tools that I found that exists in the Spanish language is the Spanish word for the environment, which is medio ambiente, or literally translated the ambient medium. That it's this kind of like interstellar profession, you know, intermezzo between the space between spaces. It's horizontal in nature, it's more feminist in structure. And I think it does more service that way, in that our profession has become more like a polymath profession, multilingual, and has become a lens that amplifies other disciplines. Whereas a generalist, you know, one of the limits to the term generalist is that, like a generalist in medicine, a general practitioner, you know, is limited in their expertise, but brings on the experts to then make the decisions later. Whereas landscape architecture doesn't end with the generalist decision making. It actually is contiguous throughout the project being built. And I've been told by other disciplines that we interact with on our projects that landscape architecture becomes a kind of a lens for them to see further in their own discipline. And so I think that generalists got us to where we are now, but it's time to think of other terms, you know, whether it's multilingual or the ambient medium. We'll get to that eventually, but I think it'll be our time to discover where these came from. And this slide describes one way to look at that is the ecology. Where did ecology come from? It came from the very first person to call himself an ecologist was Frederick Clements in the turn of the last century, 1800s into the Great Depression era. And his model for nature was linear and three-dimensional. And then the modern ecologists that came a generation after, which included the Odom brothers, after the age of satellites and real-time sensing, developed a non-spatial model, a relational model of ecology. And theirs was a snapshot. And in this image, you see the Odom model on the top in one of his sketches from his book. And then the Frederick Clements model on top, and then the Odom model at the bottom. And what's important here is what we're learning is that the definition of nature was more of a stasis in definition in the earliest ecologists thinking. And then now in the current thinking around ecology, it's a little more dynamic and regenerative. And it's not spatialized, it's relational. And so if you think of that snapshot of that old forest, of climax forest of secession, within the context of the current thinking, it wasn't that Frederick Clements' linear model, secessionary model, was inaccurate. It's just that it was a snapshot of how nature actually works, and the scale of things is fractal. That we learned in the age of the Industrial Revolution that we could conquer nature because we were separate from it, and all the religious texts of the time define a binary between people and nature. And that was a big shift at the time in the Industrial Revolution, because everything before that, going back to thousands of years to the Muisca tribe that were my ancestors, there was oneness in nature at that time, and they saw the Pachamama, like the earth, as being on equal rights as a human and treated as such, and there was inseparability between people and nature. And so the Industrial Revolution shifted that. But what we learned in the 21st century is we're getting back to understanding that a lot of these cultures around the earth that have been intact for thousands of years and not moved from their geographies, they have this knowledge still intact verbally. And Western medicine is now aligning with Eastern medicine and these ancient cultures and their bush doctors, so to speak. And at the same time, I think our design disciplines, as well as ecology itself, is now aligning itself just the way Western and Eastern medicine are building parity. I think now our way we make cities can also follow that lead and build parity with that oneness. And thinking about the Odom family and how they transform ecology, the timescales collapse. The fractal understanding of how you operate impacts about local office and how we think about our projects. And it starts at the baseline of geology, which operates in the billions of years. And the next epoch is topography in the hundreds of thousands or in the millions of years, and then hydrology in the hundreds of thousands of years, tens of thousands of years of soil type, which would include influence from glaciers, and then thousands of years in habitat, and then decades and hundreds of years in fauna. And understanding that time stack, those epochs, exist on every site we work in, and how do we operate economically within this, and how do we make sense of this in communication to governments that are in public-private partnerships, and how do we make decisions for developers who ask, why are we talking about things for billions of years? How are they impacting my return on investment today? And it's our job to demonstrate that. One of the first significant projects of our firm, this was 2006. Before 2006, Lola was kind of a nights and weekends working out of our apartment. But in 2006, we received a commission from the governor of Puerto Rico to redesign the third largest city. And it was literally the entire watershed of the third largest city. It was the perfect chance to build on all of the intellectual work of the generation before us. So, Michael van Valkenburg, James Corner Field Operations, West State, they really set the tone for what landscape architects can do in their research And I think it was important now to build that stuff and measure it and see how it performs under disturbances so that we have leaving behind a legacy of built references for resiliency and climate change for future generations to improve on. And that was one of the challenges when I was in college in the 90s and in grad school in the early 2000s was there wasn't a lot of built resiliency projects. There was plenty of sustainability projects. They're very different. And I felt a bit of frustration in that, and that I found it our generation's imperative after grad school that we had to quickly build and scale these systems and measure their performance, because you can't shape policy without metrics. So 2006, we found, come walking on the site, we found a lot of these gray infrastructure systems, gray pipes and seawalls on what was an industrial shoreline. This was tuna canning factories. Much of the Star-Kist and other tuna canning companies had their headquarters here on this beach, and they would harvest the tons of tuna that would migrate in the area and can them here. And that economy migrated out from Puerto Rico, and what left behind was a post-industrial landscape on this beach. And so converting an industrial shore back into a living shore posed some challenges from a budgetary perspective. But we only had $55 million for 2 kilometers. But we certainly didn't have enough to solve the problem we found at this beach, which was pipes leaching on the beach into the bay. And we learned that Mayaguez Bay was losing oxygen, had red tide issues, which caused loss of oxygen. And that was causing fish kills and algae to bloom on the coral reefs, which caused reef bleaching. So the way we design our cities matters. And so one of the things we learned is by one of our mentors for our firm is Eric Sanderson, and he wrote this book, Manhattan. And in Manhattan, Eric Sanderson developed a model called forensic ecology, which is to look at places and conjecturally map out what they might have been like 200 years ago. And that's an important tool for landscape architecture in the city making process. But one of the things we improved at Lola was to ground truth that conjectural mapping by finding ecological analogs or compasses environmentally that exist on the edges of the city that are still intact. And one of those analogs was some intact creeks and rivers adjacent to Mayaguez that gave us some signals about what these old creeks that are now underground in these pipes in the city might have interacted with the ocean. And are there lessons that we can bring back into the city? And the first lesson is that these creeks, the sine curve of the creek increases as it approaches the sea, and it doesn't actually touch the sea. There's actually separation of sand between the river mouth and the ocean on a dry day. And only when there was a heavy rain, would that dune system open up and let the river mouth flow into the ocean. And so one of the details that we found that was really interesting about this project is we didn't have to bring this whole river mouth into the city. We can just bring what is nature's check valve, for lack of a better idiom. That is this sand dune that would open up and close within hours. And the forces that closed it were littoral drift of the ocean and the trade winds blowing sand particles. And so we want to—
Walter,
yeah.
are you? There might be a setting. I'm getting real low res on your
Okay.
imagery. So Topher, sorry to interrupt, but I want to make sure we're seeing these visuals. Topher said it might be that optimized for video setting.
Okay.
And if you click that back off, we can get the.
Okay, let me get this to stabilize. There it goes. Okay. Zoom. Is it in the audio settings?
I think it was in
Share
that.
screen,
Yeah.
Oh,
and then in the lower right hand, share sound, but don't
optimize
check
for video clip.
optimize
Okay.
for video.
All right, share.
Much better.
Yeah, big difference?
Yeah, great.
Good to know. Okay.
Yeah, very
okay.
good.
Lesson learned, Topher. You're a pro.
Sorry,
Thank
folks.
you.
Thanks, Topher.
Okay, and make sure you guys can see the full slides and not the screen of speakers, right? You're seeing the full slides.
Good.
That's
Thank you,
right.
Alec. All right, I'll proceed. That was worth the interruption. Thank you for that. And so the lesson here is, how do we bring nature's check valve back into the city while maintaining and understanding the real estate pressures of a dense city like this? It's not enough room to bring in an entire ecosystem, but you can bring in the performative aspects of certain moments in that ecosystem. And so the project looked to convert what was a post-industrial shore into a series of wetlands that had different functions, primarily for protecting the city, protecting the sea from the city as a sustainability measure, that is water quality. Having the wetlands designed as essentially a sewage treatment plant, but done biologically through phytoremediation, sedimentation, and dilution. And the graphic on the bottom describes, the primary treatment of sediments, the bacteria that live in the roots of these hydric species of plants that polish the water, removing a lot of the nutrients and oils and runoff. And then finally, polishing that sand dune. There's a sand dune that's designed that has two parts to it. There's the sand dune on top that helps to split wave energy in a surge. The bottom of the sand dune is functioning as a sand polishing bed, which is a sand polishing bed is a typical means of polishing water in a septic system. And so the subsurface of this project is functioning for sustainability, while the surface is functioning for resiliency. The bottom being water quality and the top being about attenuating risk. And since the project went across 2 kilometers, it's a big chunk of the city, and a park at this scale can start to modulate its program based on the adjacent land use or program of the city in the different neighborhoods that front this. This is a section near a junior high school where there was a curriculum that was marrying Michael Pollan's dream of the food system and the economic system. And the goal here was to have on Saturdays a farmer's market. And this is overflow parking for beach festivals that happen. And when there's not overflow parking, it's a porous living surface that can support farmers markets, artisan markets in the project. And then the section that was near an elementary school had a different scale to it. And so, the spaces were more aligned to elementary use weekdays as opposed to weekend use on a junior high. And it's important to note that, there's a big difference between resilient systems and regenerative systems. Resiliency can be both gray and green and blue, but regenerative is only the living systems, right? And so what you see here is you see a hard seawall. That's your standard Army Corps of Engineers seawall that was part of the project. And you use the regenerative systems in front of it to do the sacrificial work of multi-layered management of the risk of an oncoming hurricane or tsunami or surge. And you basically, when it's designed properly, the hard gray infrastructure, the resilient system is going to be never doing its job. It's there as a spine, as the kind of last line of defense, but each layer in front of it going out to the ocean has different functions, some for surge, some for waves, some for urban flotsam, such as the loose boats and docks that come in with a hurricane. The other goal for our project was to design the maintenance of recovery to be low cost, such that a municipal budget would be all that would be required to recover after a major disturbance. And so if you notice the project where it ends, there's a bridge off in the upper left corner, and further off the project, there's the Army Corps seawall. And I'll show you some images coming up where we compare how this project performed and the Army Corps seawall with Hurricane Maria. Took millions of dollars and is still under reconstruction with federal money. And it's the same shoreline, just a different approach. The image on the left shows pre-construction image that shows Mayaguez Bay on a dry day. And you can see how much particulate is there on a day with very minimal runoff. And the image on the right is taken 3 days, it's taken 3 years after the design was built and the grow-in period was finished. So the grow-in period is a period of time when all the roots are interconnected, all the phytoremediating wetlands are polishing water as designed. It's kind of like the period of time to commission the project and allow people to measure how it works. And if you remember that pipe that we found on the first slide of this project that was on the beach, we clipped it back to the image on the right. So we moved it inland away from the shore, and you see that every street end had one of these stormwater pipes. Now, to make matters more difficult, we had very truncated time, very small budget, but we had a lot of political will and a lot of room in the regulatory space to build what at the time was illegal to build in New York City. But in Puerto Rico, we had the trust of the Departamento de Recursos Naturales, their equivalent of New York State has a DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation. There's a Department of Resources, of Natural Resources. And so they gave us a lot of bandwidth to not just do restoration, but do restoration on the auspice of ecosystem services that, building habitat can both help the ecosystem as well as the human ecosystem. But one of the things we had to focus on was maintenance. We wanted to make sure that this park was able to be maintained for decades, even after being hit by hurricanes. And that included understanding how storm pipes are managed today. And that one of the things we learned is they did not have any data of those storm pipes uphill. So we had no clue how big the watersheds were. We had no clue how much water is flowing to the system. But we did, however, know that pipe size. And so we measured that pipe size and worked with our sub-consulting engineers to figure out the peak flow. And once we understood peak flow, it may be oversized in our wetlands, but we'll have plenty of room for, even a 1,000-year rain event. So we oversized what code required. The code required a 10-year rain event in terms of stormwater management, and we were hitting 1,000-year. One of the things we learned is that once we had the peak flow from that pipe size, that 90% of the particulates come in the first 20 minutes in this area. And so if we can just capture that first half-hour flow, we'll get 90% of that for the first flush. And that required a series of layered wetlands. The other piece is understanding how maintenance is done in the city. They had those standard vac trucks, those big trucks with a boom on it and a vacuum. And so we designed the wetland to receive that vac truck. And so even that sidewalk on the right is where a vac truck pulls up and is able to remove solids. One of the big challenges of designing wetlands in cities is solid management. You're getting Coke bottles and all kinds of plastics flowing from that pipe, and they collect, and you have to have a collection zone. And nature provides this great surface for that, and it's the rhizomes of the black mangrove. So this image you see here is a black mangrove tree. If you look at these little knees coming up from underneath, that's where they host a lot of oysters and a lot of fish hatcheries happen in there. There's a lot of ecosystemic functions, but it's also nature's best filter for solids. And so in this basin, the vac truck can come once per month and vacuum out all the solids. And the system stays really clean, surprisingly. The entire system is able to be polished within 72 hours. So it's designed for 72-hour residency time. with 6 gallons per hour per square foot of treatment. So every square foot of oyster and all the habitat that comes in here, this splicata, Spanish grass, salt grass, excuse me, not Spanish grass, the black mangroves and all the benthic species, every square foot is treating 6 gallons per hour. So that's how we're able to size the wetland against the pipe size. So it's really marrying the performance metrics that nature provides with what we're given from the current engineering of the city. And this is a photo after Hurricane Maria. So Hurricane Maria hit in 2017. This project was already a decade old, and it was an important test of some of the systems. It wasn't perfectly resilient, and it was very nervous for me to come and visit the site after the hurricane and interview everyone, because approaching the site, this is what Lola set out to do. I mean, we're like, did it work? We weren't sure. And I went there and I found some things worked as designed, and so there were some surprises. But once we started to interview some of the business owners and interview the municipal staff who were doing the recovery, we learned that for the most part, we're about 90% on target, 91% on target in terms of the resiliency strategies. And I'm sharing with you in the next slide what I call the metrics of imperfection. We weren't perfect. We want to share the occupancy metrics after a hurricane to show how we would improve our next project and share with the world on where resiliency can improve as well, since this is a kind of work in progress. And so first thing to look at is there were 2 systems in the park. There were there were permanent kind of bones of the park, the most of the concrete that you see. And then there were secondary sacrificial systems that includes the railing and the lighting. And the railing, if you notice, it's wood with cable stay. It was designed so that there would be every 15 or 20 years, the wood would be redone. And it saved on capital budget, also increased job security for the park ongoing. And interestingly, we also keyed that maintenance budget into the frequency that storms would hit this area. So it was expected that a minor storm would hit this area every decade or 2, and a major storm kind of once in a generation. But as we know, with climate change, we had 2 once in a generation storms back to back. We had Hurricane Dorian 2 weeks later, followed by Cat 5 Dorian, not Dorian, Hurricane Irma. They're all happening so fast, I mixed the names up and I apologize. Hurricane Irma, Cat 5, followed 2 weeks later by Hurricane Maria, nearly Cat 5 when it came ashore in Puerto Rico. So the other secondary system, if you look on the left, the wood collapse as designed. And if you notice, the layers are working. So you'll see the rack line. The rack line is all the debris that piles up after a hurricane. The urban forests, this is an afforestation project. So it was all industrial. Everything you see was planted. You may ask yourself, how can a tree that big, be there in 15 years? Well, in the tropics, trees grow 5 feet a year. It's pretty incredible how much they jump out of the ground. And so we learned that the urban forest was able to capture a lot of the urban flotsam. And that was from the lived experience of the businesses that you see on the right of this slide. They told us that, when the surge started to come in, that the debris stayed within the coastline there. And they said that the surge came through the forest and stopped right about where the road was. And they thought it was over at that point, that the hurricane receded and the surge receded. But then the Hurricane Maria's bands stalled in the mountains behind uphill from here. And the mountain streets became rivers as they flowed down to the beach. And so all the streets that you see on the right side became deep rivers of fresh water coming from the mountains after they thought the storm was over. And the business owners said that, the entire neighborhood started to flood, but as soon as it hit the rim elevation of that roadbed, it started to pour over into the wetlands. And so the finished floor elevation of the existing low-lying buildings were spared by about 3 inches to spare a freeboard once the wetlands were able to engage and support that oncoming flow of the mountains, the mountain rain. And so that was an important detail that we didn't design for. We didn't design for a 1,000-year rain event coming from the mountains. We actually designed these wetlands to receive the 1,000-year flow at the pipe, and also had to model it with the Caribbean Tsunami Institute. So the Caribbean Tsunami Institute is a subset of NOAA. And whenever you build in earthquake zones like this that receives tsunamis, you have to design your project not for minor tsunamis, but for major tsunamis. And what is the issue there? It's not you can stop a tsunami that's major. In fact, it goes up and over the forest and goes into the city. It's that you're designing so that there's drainage after the tsunami recedes. Because a lot of the death toll is not just the immediate impact. A lot of the loss of life happens with bacteria outbreaks that happen weeks after a tsunami recedes with standing water. So we had to prove that there was all this positive drainage in the system. So this happy outcome of that was that, well, this 1,000-year rain event that came from the mountains, not just the pipe, had storage area in these wetlands because we sized them for tsunamis. And here are the metrics. You know, the coastal forest was 91% intact. If we were to improve that, we would do more clustered planting. And a trick I learned later on from studying a project, which is the Copacabana in Rio, designed by Burley Marx, is if you look at the street ends of the Copacabana, he puts amenities, you know, cafes and shops at each street end, and then wraps it in clusters of trees at those most vulnerable locations, those street openings in the urban wall of Rio. And I would do those clusters at a larger mass moving forward. The minor damage to the railing lighting was as expected, and not a big budget to recover with, and was in line with the budgets that were set ongoing for the park anyway, for the upgrades of the railings. There was no loss of drainage through the phytoremediation wetland through the entire project as the storm receded. And that was an important win for us, that the primary function of this system for managing water continued to maintain positive drainage. And that even after the hurricane, there was no work required in the wetlands other than the debris you see in there. The system continued to flow, and the oysters, the mosquito-eating fish, gambusia they're called, and all the other species were able to sustain the shock, didn't get flushed out, and there wasn't much work to do in the wetlands. And so they maintained their 6 gallon per hour per square foot treatment at 72-hour residency time. And 1 month after the hurricane, the park had a big jazz festival reopening, and it was an important recovery spirit island-wide. The Mayaguez Jazz Festival is kind of the big deal island-wide. Everybody comes to this town for it. And they had this big festival 1 month after the hurricane, and it was a kind of lifting of the spirits for Mayaguez. And that was an important cultural moment. And it was just 10 people, 10 municipal employees that did 2 kilometers of coastline on what was about, tens of thousands of dollars in a budget for recovery. Whereas the next section of coast, which had the hard infrastructure of the seawall, still being recovered with millions of dollars in federal money to do that. And the businesses behind the seawall off of our site, away from this photo, took 6 months to recover, and some of them never came back, went bankrupt. But the 30 businesses that live, that have their addresses fronting this project, never got flooded. They opened the next business day. And there's this interrelationship between regenerative infrastructure or living infrastructure and business continuity of these small entrepreneurs. So that project was 2006, we designed it. And right around 2008, 2009, the congresswoman from our district in Brooklyn, where our studio was, Congresswoman Nydia Velasquez, she loved the Mayaguez Project. In fact, she told me, Walter, I'm bringing Mayaguez model to the Hispanic Caucus in DC. So the Congressional Hispanic Caucus meets once a year. It's all their, electeds who have a largely Hispanic constituents. And some of these electeds are Hispanic themselves. Get together and talk about, equity issues, as well as saving the American dream, And one of the things she presented was the Mayaguez model to Congress. And after her presentation, I come from a background of coastal expertise because my family built wooden sailboats and we would sail them across the Atlantic. And I'm more comfortable in the ocean than I am on land. But I never understood how much this work could apply to any water system inland until Senator Harry Reid and his staff came up to me after Nydia's presentation and said, what do you think about Nevada riverfronts? And he's the senator of Nevada. And I thought, well, it's just how water and land interact. One is salt, one is fresh. I suppose these could apply. And he was worried about, the runoff from the pipes into there. And so I realized that, that it's not just a coastal problem. This is water writ large across the country. And so since that period of time, 2009, it put us on the radar for the Obama administration. And we started to advise on what are the limits to resilient thinking? Why can't we, why is this such an outlier? Why can't we get more projects that are like this? And what laws do we need to change to do that? And what emerged was what I saw in my witness was the first time of design-led policymaking. That is, not setting design decisions at the very end of a process, but letting design decisions influence what's in the way. Because what I was finding is there were brilliant practitioners who were my peers, from Kadorf at Scape to Westate, who were kind of a generation before, but they were hitting limits in the United States on what you can do legally. There's a lot of brilliant people who know what to do. In terms of education, they're educated landscape architects in the age of resiliency and climate change. They had an idea of what can be done, but they didn't know how to get there. And I felt like that was the next round of work, was to push through legal limits and push through financial limits to this. And advising on this is where we scaled up. And this was before Hurricane Sandy. So Hurricane Sandy hits in 2012. And it was a massive amount of information on climate change that even mainstream media could not ignore. And for the first time, resiliency was published in the mainstream, largely by Andrew Zolli from PopTech, who wrote the book on resilience, How Things Bounce Back. But he wrote in the New York Times article for the first time, resiliency showing up in the mainstream. And it's no longer an academic exercise, which was my experience in the 90s and early 2000s. And now it's started to migrate the mainstream. It was largely bigger than myself and our work. We're just, conveying this, and at some point we'll pass the ball to the next generation and keep building. We have no ego or ownership on this. We just happen to stumble into this with imperfections. But we started to advise all the agencies on natural infrastructure. This is a session with NOAA, HHS, FEMA, led by the White House, HUD, and the US Forest Service on interagency thinking around resilience and what loopholes in the current laws can be enlarged to allow these projects to happen in the United States, or at least in New York and not just Puerto Rico. And we started to scale that up and advise as co-authors on pages, white papers on incorporating natural infrastructure and ecosystem services and federal decision-making. And this is an important document for any students who are interested on how do we break through the boundaries to create regenerative systems as a standard rather than an outlier. And in this case, it's building parity in the economic model, the benefit cost analysis that Army Corps uses, for example, of one of many agencies, for the return on investment of federal dollars in mitigation. Well, the problem there is that they have these formulas that go back to the 1800s for seawalls, but they don't have as rigid formulas for natural infrastructure. And so this was mandating that these districts, and in this case, the New York District of Army Corps, and all the districts around the country start to use this as a means of decision-making. And one of the commanders of the district in New York at the time that we worked with was Colonel Belay, Colonel John Belay. And he later on went into private practice. and he's now an executive at Dewberry. And we teamed with Dewberry to do a series of pilot projects along the Mississippi State Coast. This was a commission with the state of Mississippi, and it's a kind of a coastal resiliency plan that was funded by the oil spill money. And what we looked at is, there were these creeks that came in similar to Mayaguez into the cities along the Gulf Coast. And they were now just channelized concrete, open channels instead of pipes like Mayaguez. However, we had a different asset here in that, looking at the forensic ecology of the place, there were ancient islands offshore that helped reduce the wave runout. So we had another tool in the toolbox. So we introduced a multi-layered dune system and the interdunal swales that manage the water, similar to what you saw in Mayaguez. But in addition, we had a micro bayou strategy. So turning these outfalls into micro bayous, similar to a bayou in the Mississippi Delta. And building islands offshore that were not just about splitting wave energy, but actually had a concave shape to the contours, so that we can, almost like a cistern, capture rainwater and funnel it to the center of the island and capture this phenomenon that happens in all coastlines around the world. It's a phenomenon developed by two Northern European scientists, Guyben, G-H-Y-B-E-N, Guyben, and Herzberg, H-E-R-Z-B-E-R-G-E-R. So Guyben, Herzberg, these two guys got together and figured out that there's this freshwater lens of rainwater that's in every single sand island around the world. And once you understand that groundwater, you can design around that bubble, and it supports a diversity of species that would not normally exist on just a sand island with salt. But when you have fresh water, it supports all kinds of rare and endangered species. But most importantly, from a resiliency perspective, that fresh water supports woody vegetation. Why woody vegetation? It's exponentially more rough against surges than herbaceous vegetation. So dune grass is wonderful in terms of root zone, but its herbaceous layer is rather soft against waves. But that woody vegetation is rigid and really holds up against that wave energy, as well as that urban flotsam that you saw in Puerto Rico. And so these islands are developed to have a woody core with that Guyben-Herzberg freshwater lens in the center, and then a herbaceous edge to it on the dune system on the front edge. It also created a cove space behind for a lot of the hatchlings and species that move back and forth between fresh and salt water. So it created a multi-layered system for managing resiliency, sustainability, and also fighting extinction with the same funding that came from the Deepwater Horizon money that happened a decade before. And this is a cross-section to that multi-layered dune system, and thinking also about the culture of the place. This was a very scenographic form. If you look at the plan graphic on the right, it was actually a series of stretch perspectives. So we took your typical dune layering that happens with the primary dune on the right, secondary and tertiary dune systems, and then stretch the perspective of the contour line, so that as you're driving along the road, the coastal road, it's a series of scenes that are happening that warp between stretching perspective and collapsing perspective. So it's actually set up as a stage set. So 2017 had another impact in Miami. This project that we built in Miami is called Miracle Mile. Similar to Mayaguez, we designed for these 1,000-year rain events, which is exponentially beyond the code requirement, because we had tools for that we're learning are working really well. We teamed with an incredible architecture firm that was my first employer out of graduate school, Cooper Robertson, led by the late Jack Robertson and Alex Cooper. Alex Cooper and his former partner, Stan Exta, did Battery Park City, the master plan for Battery Park City. And Jack Robertson designed Stuyvesant High School in Battery Park City. And what I learned about Cooper Robertson is what is required to build, good city making in architectural terms in Manhattan, and one of the most dense real estate markets on the planet. And I use those devices that I learned as a director of sustainability at Cooper Robertson to start our firm and understand the economics involved in city making, and how we can hack that with ecological decision making. And so, Lola's on her own. We've grown, and then Cooper Robertson reaches out to partner. And this was, to this date, the most resilient streetscape on the planet in terms of capacity of absorption. And how we prove this is there was only a $27 million budget for what was just a Coral Gables as a neighborhood in Miami that's historically wealthy and has a long history to it. Miami doesn't have a lot of history in terms of built environment. It's fairly new. And this is one of those nodes with a lot of heritage, relatively speaking. And it had some aging infrastructure. It had an old stormwater pipe on the right that was meeting the limit of what it can handle in terms of increased density in the neighborhood, as well as climate change. The rain events are getting more intense per hour, and that's been hard to manage, these flash floods. In Miami, they don't call them flash floods, they call them rain bombs. But what we proved is that a multi-layered stack of porous paving, structural soils, and what's called NGI, network green infrastructure, that all the trees are connected to each other, was a means of handling and doubling the current 3 inches of rain that we treated in that pipe. Could be double with another 3 or 4 inches just with the surface treatments without having to dig up any more pipes. And during construction, we excavated the entire public realm to remove that ancient coral reef stone, and then brought in structural soils so that we had storage capacity, and also allowed all the tree roots to interconnect so they can exchange nutrients and hold more water than even the forest that would have been there 200 years ago. So we're kind of supercharging the urban forests with these new structural soils as a network system. Aesthetically, Miami has these incredibly visual clouds, these really vertical cumulonimbus, and they come every afternoon. So every afternoon, the Everglades warms up and the hot air and moisture rises up, and then it drifts towards Miami Beach and it washes the city. And if you've ever been in Miami, the city, it's crystal clean. It's amazing how clean the city is because it gets washed every day by these intense rain events. I mean, so intense that if that rain had hit New York, it would cause billions of dollars in damage in the subway. And so we finished the stone that we went around, trying to find stone that is native from North America, as well as stone that is native to South America. Miami is kind of this hub of the Americas in many ways. And what's beautiful about working there is we have access to quarries in Brazil, for example, where we found the bluest stone in our hemisphere is a quarry outside of Rio. It's this blue quartz. And we finished it to look like that Miami sky, where you get the dark gray and white clouds, and then you get the apertures of blue sky between the clouds. We want to have that sky married on the ground. And another section of the project was driven by raindrops. And how does resiliency start to have an aesthetic expression? That I don't feel that resiliency should be an engineering decision. I think it should be part of the humanities. It should be form finding. That generation of form can come from this deep understanding of this ancient systems. And also taking the form that you create, and in this case, the raindrops, and not only is it part of the paving system and the porous joints that redirect water to the trees, but it can also be part of a canvas for local artisans. In this case, a local welder that helped us take the partie at multiple scales in the water infrastructure. And so this photo was taken after Hurricane Irma hit. 1 month after the project opened, Hurricane Irma hits in 2017 and drops the heaviest rain ever measured in Coral Gables. And it didn't clog. All the debris what didn't concentrate into one place and a single drain line as would normally happen. Typically these drains clog in a single spot. But when you do a decentralized linear system like this, all the shop owners see the debris building up, are able to sweep it out. So it decentralizes not only the drainage, but the maintenance of it. It becomes part of the culture of the place. Furthermore, the project was an atmospheric gallery. Our work, we've had the opportunity to collaborate with some of the artists who shaped our thinking in undergrad and grad, and now working with Agnes Denez Michelle O'Connor, Ai Weiwei. It's been an amazing time for landscape and art to really conflate now. In this case, it's an atmospheric gallery where all dimensions of this project, including the sky and the walls and the floor, are places for ephemeral art that is curated seasonally, as well as permanent art that is part of the culture and wayfinding of the place. So this is now shifting to New York City. We're currently designing on several islands in New York. So these are the 3 urban islands in New York City. This is the island on the left these are 3 urban islands. There's many islands in New York State, but only 3 urban islands. There's in terms of coastal. There's Coney Island, Rockaway, and Long Beach. And one of the projects we're working on now is the first fossil fuel-free neighborhood in New York City. It's a regenerative neighborhood, and I'll go through it briefly as we're running out of time. But New York Times author Stefanos Chen wrote about this project, calling it the building on the front line of climate change in New York. And this is a mix of outer borough archetypes, so taking mixed-use Queens-type buildings. We're on the coast here in Queens, New York, as well as townhouses, and then along the beach, bungalows. In this neighborhood in Rockaway is known for its bungalows, but no one's built new bungalows since World War II. And we felt this was an important opportunity for micro-housing and for affordability and ownership opportunities for starter families. Building a rung in the ladder between subsidized housing and ownership. And there's also affordable housing as a part of this project. But everything is getting all its energy from the site, which is pretty exciting. And we start with energy efficiency, leveraging that, tens of thousands of years ago, there was the Wisconsin Glacier pushed down from the north and stopped right before our project and left behind an incredible capacity for geothermal. So everything you see in red is what I call geothermal country in Brooklyn and Queens. So our site is in Rockaway on the south edge of this frame. And everything you see in red is where the soil is porous, the groundwater is elevated, and it's low cost to get all of your earth energy for heating and cooling just from under the building. And turning what is everything you see in white here, and the white line in the center of the drawing is an ancient freshwater lens that is trying to establish a wetland. But the way the city currently manages its grid is fighting that system. And we want to design a neighborhood that doesn't stop that force, but actually bends it and works with it. And it's working with a massive kind of cut and fill project, since we're moving 500,000 cubic yards of fill to get this project to be out of floodplain, but also not shed water to the lower lying neighborhoods. And this is New York City's, it's the size of Battery Park City in terms of acreage, but a density of outer borough Queens, unifying a contiguous network of open spaces that address, pandemics and the importance of outdoor space, not just for COVID, but further. We're getting more frequent outbreaks of these types with climate change, and also having ways to manage water in those same networks. So it's a wellness circuit as well as a water circuit. At the core is a restaurant row, where currently in Rockaway, there's already an informal circular economy where the Michelin rated restaurants and their star chefs are taking the waste from their restaurants and bringing it to the community gardens, and the community gardens are growing rows set aside just for that single chef and his food. And so we want to formalize that in this project with waste to energy systems such as anaerobic digesters, and solarizing all surfaces, including parking lots, and every surface is porous, so that the building and the site are coupled as one system that manages water from cloud to ground, including networked green infrastructure like you saw in Miracle Mile, as well as new groundwater management landscapes, and leveraging the aspect that a single tree can move 100 gallons a day out of the groundwater into the air during the hottest time of the year, when that urban heat island effect is at its peak. And when you add that to thousands of trees, it's millions of gallons moved out in a day. And parts of this master plan are starting to get built. This is Beach Green. The first, almost 80% of its energy is coming from the site because of the geothermal systems that we designed. You see in these wells on the right with a series of subconsultants. And the project has, solar trellises over the parking lots with porous paving systems that are designed for groundwater to move up and down without impacting the substructure. And that majority of the native vegetation is edible, which is important in a food desert. And then integrating a beach plaza at its core, where a new restaurant row and all the urban farms are connected, and you can walk and bike easily around the project without dealing with automobiles, and leveraging that beach culture that exists on the boardwalk, and then connecting it to the A train. And that A train gets you to Times Square. So you can come off Times Square onto this scene and have all these wooden buildings with cross-laminated timber and solar, and a whole neighborhood is able to work off-grid and be a safe place to be in a future disturbance. With some of the largest batteries being built in New York in private buildings to be able to work off-grid. The last thing I'll share with you is, landscape thinking can not just influence city making, but also the energy space. And in this case, we designed a 0.5 megawatt solar array that survived Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. Imagine a football field of solar up in the 9 stories in the air and having it survive the hurricane. But we also learned that there were mistakes, bolts that were sheared that we could have learned from. And 1/3 of the solar arrays were impacted in Puerto Rico at this time. So you lost 30% of the solar on most of your projects. But here we only lost 8%. And we're just showing, in this case, how it was lost and the metrics of how we can improve these solar arrays. Most importantly, the solar array kept a supermarket that fed 60,000 people operational during the recovery. And it's an important story of resiliency that we share these metrics with FEMA. So we design buildings in downtown areas in a way that is able to keep the doors open during the disturbance. But our work in doing these neighborhood scale projects builds relationships with CEOs of these solar companies. And we learned with Hurricane Maria, my father lives there in Puerto Rico, and he said, it's pretty bad in the neighborhood. I don't know how the island is, but try to get down here because there's no power. And that turned out to be weeks and months of no power. And we couldn't get any solar systems that were donated from these CEOs to the island without flying them in. So we teamed with artists such as Lin-Manuel Miranda, who wrote Hamilton, Ai Weiwei, and various others who came together in the art community, as well as the Puerto Rican, Neo-Rican community in New York, and surfers who got together with designers to kind of pull together a shadow government to fly the solar in and energize facilities for free. We started out doing hospitals in this emergency facility in Isabela in Puerto Rico, and got the emergency room doors open so they can service 60,000 people, and energize women-owned bakeries throughout the island so they can feed locals. Victor Cruz, the New York Giants wide receiver, came down and got a handicapped disabled facility energized. And in the last couple of years, we converted from the emergency of getting lights on to workforce development for women. We learned there were no women working in solar in Puerto Rico, maybe a dismal 15%. And we wanted to build a whole army of entrepreneurial women that can grow wealth in Puerto Rico in the energy space. And so our first graduates just graduated this year, and it's called Solar Libre. And it's a nonprofit project we created through the Coastal Marine Resource Center. I'll leave this last slide with you. We'll start Q&A. This was a orphanage that was children the age of my child who hadn't seen anybody for months after the hurricane. There was no food or water, no energy. And so they had optimistically decorated this Christmas tree. And we came across them in the mountains of Puerto Rico with our solar team. And within one day, they saw us go up on the roof, solarize, and kind of bring them the future. And I'll show you this countdown where we turn the lights on and you hear them.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Energía de sol. Mira, no hay que prender la planta, ¿lo ves?
So I'll leave it there. We can go back to slides if we need to, but I'll open up the Q&A to the team.
Okay.
And actually, I'm going to step away for 30 seconds to take care of one thing really quick. I'll be right back.
Yeah, please. So that's a perfect opportunity for me to remind folks that you can enter your questions for our speaker using the WPSU interface, and I will convey them to Walter. So I don't know if there are folks waiting for the end of the lecture to input questions, but please go ahead and I will see them in my feed. So I definitely have some questions for Walter when he gets back. I don't know if we can do just a double check on the question platform, just to make sure people are getting through.
Okay.
All right. So thanks so much for that, Walter. That was really, really interesting, and I was aware of some of those projects and had studied up since we talked. But yeah, I was really inspired, and if you don't mind, I'll start with a question, just about something that's striking. It was striking to me when I visited your studio back in 2016, and I'm so happy to see it continuing through. And that is that it's your work is functioning at a huge scale and a extremely human tactile scale, and also that there's this really kind of dynamic relationship between the big instrumental and sort of like natural systems engineering parts, if you would even separate out those things, and the kind of experiential aesthetic things, the kind of thinking that goes down to the type of paver. And you hinted at it, but I'd like to hear you talk about how those two things are interwoven in your process. And I think maybe we guess that the aesthetics come at the end. It's the dressing that comes at the end once you've figured out all the serious questions. I'm kind of setting you up for that, but I'm guessing it's not exactly like that. And I'm curious to hear you speak more about it.
It does mostly come together at the end, but there is a kind of it's cyclical. You'll get pulses of ideas of what it's going to feel like. But this approach was verified when we were there in Puerto Rico with Ai Weiwei, and we had dinner at Parque Litoral in the restaurant that's there. And he asked me to give a tour of the park, and he said, Walter, when I was, first starting my career, I did this project that was similar, coastal or river's edge park, and I featured all these architects. It was a very similar budget. Said we had $50 million, and I featured the chair of the architecture program at GSD, Toshiko Mori, and a bunch of other architects in his project. And he goes, it's very similar to this. And I remember him saying, what the way I approach my art is how I see you're approaching your design work, in that, none of my pieces are, they're never the same thing. It comes from the research of the place. And that was like the most encouraging thing I've heard about our review of our work was from the most celebrity artists who's just in there working on equity issues and speaking to power globally. And one thing I learned is he said, look, my artwork is 99% the research of the site, listening to the experts of the site, which is the community, as well as the actual expert stakeholders, but all in. And then at the very end is when the aesthetics really snap together. But what I find in design is slightly different than art in that you get pulses of the aesthetic beforehand, not beforehand, but as you're developing the project, but it all does definitely gel at the very end, like you said, Alec. But I will share that, you know, I have a performing arts background and aesthetics matter a lot. The arts in general matter. And historically, when I was in grad school, there was a binary. There were I was deeply interested in the ecosystem and the bioregion and regenerative thinking and resiliency as the next steps from sustainability, which sustainability was the age before us. And what I found is professors were either, they were either like engineering landscape type folks, or they were interested in the humanities and aesthetics, and only that, just form finders. And that's sort of that was the end of that binary thinking, was that last generation. And what you're seeing now across all disciplines of design is the next generation. If you look at the folks who are just hitting it now, like just hitting their stride, like Björk Ingels in architecture and big, he comes in saying how he got his first building. And he's a good friend of mine. We sail together and hang out a lot. He told me the story of his first building. And he said, it was in New York City, and Douglas Durst had this presentation for that site that Björk ended up building his first building on, but it was another building that was presented. And Björk, the smart ass, in the back, European guy, raises his hand after the end of the presentation, and this very, respected developer, Douglas Durst, lets him, go ahead and ask a question. He says, if the building was truly sustainable from the inside and out, shouldn't the archetype be different and it not be a rectangle with a different kind of skin? And it was like embarrassing for Douglas Durst because no one in New York talks to him like that at all. So who's this punk kid in the back? And that's just a story of how he got his first commission. But it was, speaking to power and being true to the core that you don't have to choose between being the technician and the artist in design. The next generation is all in, And if you look at each of our projects, we're not a style shop. Like most people hire us that are interested in the work, and they're like, every project's different. What do you do? And I said, well, it's authentic. It's coming from the site, or it's coming from the community. And the term local is taken seriously. We treat the community as a brain trust. And we have a massive budget for community outreach because we're not just outreaching. It's form finding process. It's aesthetics. We're also testing ideas with the community that they gave us. And we're saying, is this what you told us? And they said, we get redirection, no, you're way off base. We'll come back again. But it's a totally different approach. And you're seeing this approach, not just with Björk Ingels, you're seeing firms like Mass Design Group, who are hybrid nonprofits. For me, Lola is for profit, but I also am the director of Coastal Marine Resource Center, which is a nonprofit. And some projects work within capitalism, which is Lola, and some projects work around capitalism, which is the NGO. It allows us to do projects like you saw Solar Libre, which are designing, kind of bending the way humans live on the planet by re-engineering how the socioeconomy works in a place. In this case, empowering women to get more hands on deck economically, so we have a just recovery. It isn't just about equity and gender equity, but is about, it's an economic strategy as well. We're empowering those that for a million years have not been empowered, and transforming them on the front and putting them in a place where they're decision makers and leading as entrepreneurs. Now we have 8 graduates of Solar Libre, and they're all working in the industry as decision makers in Puerto Rico, some of which are starting their own companies, are going to be future CEOs, getting big federal grants, of which we're showing them how to write all the contracts for those projects. So it's really just getting behind these folks and giving them resources and then getting out of their way. This isn't like, white savior coming in with all my ideas that's going to save your community. It is just giving some ingredients, empowering them, and decolonizing the way we design cities.
Yeah, thanks. There was a question about working as an advisor to Obama, and just talking a little bit more about what that was like.
Yeah, there's a lot of layers in governance, and some of the professors and alum from GSD were absorbed into the program at Harvard, at the White House. So for example, the previous administration was Bush, and they had a lot of Yale professors, right? And then Obama gets in office, builds a basketball court in the White House, and then hires all these Harvard professors. He goes from the conservative Ivy League to the progressive Ivy League. And a lot of those folks were there. And so in addition to Nydia putting us on the radar, the Congresswoman, we had staff who knew about our work, and brought us in on a series of roundtables that you saw the photos of, but of which those executives we built a relationship with, so that in Hurricane Maria, we're able to scale up and build trust with, FEMA and Army Corps guys, and the chief technology officer of the US government, those kind of executives who flew us into Puerto Rico to advise right after the hurricane on, we saw what we did with Puerto Rico, with New York post Sandy. How do we scale it up nationwide in Puerto Rico? And so that relationship's built on even through the changing administration, because those executives that we work with, it wasn't like I had a lot of FaceTime with Obama. It actually doesn't matter about that cult of personality. It's the people he brings in. It's the brain trust. So that brain trust was still intact through the next administration, through the Trump era. So despite the amount of neglect that I found in Puerto Rico, including those orphans that hadn't received any FEMA support, well, I take that back. They had one FEMA support. The guy told me, the director said, FEMA came through and gave me an application for an SBA loan. I'm like, he didn't bring any food or water? He goes, no, we sat here for weeks. And then a church came, and then a corporation dropped a pallet of water. We've been living off that. But and he didn't know about solar and battery being a way to do it. He figured solar panels just reduce your energy bill. He didn't realize it was not just a sustainability measure, but a resiliency measure. That's just a long way of saying that our nonprofit was working at the edges of the grid, and the work we did with Obama set us up to advise Army Corps and FEMA on working on the center of the grid out. And we made sure that the little resources that were there from the federal government were complemented with the massive movement of nonprofits coming into the space. So we essentially worked from the edge of the grid in, and they worked from the center of the grid out, and now started to meet in the middle, which is interesting.
Thanks. So I have so many questions if there's time after this, but I'll ask one from the feed that could be a good closer, see where you take it. Your work is incredibly inspiring and truly underscores the importance of 21st century landscape architecture. Thank you for being such a powerful change agent and role model. What do you expect may be a particular opportunity area for the next generation of landscape architects?
I think we don't know yet, because it's just now we're seeing the impact of it. And it's not just me, it's our generation's getting a taste of it. I think the graduates coming out of school now are going to find new space for landscape thinking. And I think the profession, if the way it's being managed, if it doesn't realize how big the space it's getting into, other professions are going to co-opt it. And you have to be careful, right? What does that mean? It either means we're going to narrow our scope and stick with landscape architecture and the navel gazing that's happening today, or I'm starting to see good signs, like ASLA now has a Black CEO just this year, a little late, but the old white boy country club of ASLA is starting to change, even from the inside out, And I think we're going to start to see, the power structures start to be questioned. I think we're going to get to a period of time where landscape architecture you're going to see, a landscape architecture president and a governor, but we're already getting mayors, right? The Army Corps of Engineers had a commander named Thomas Asbury. Thomas Asbury was educated as a landscape architect at Virginia Tech. And he had this nature first approach in New York City. That district really led other districts in terms of, living infrastructure and nature-based systems. So my point is that I think once landscape architects step into their power, will really start to transform the way decision-making happens in governance and the way that our cities are made. And Arvernese that I showed in Rockaway in Queens is one of the first landscape architecture-led city-making projects in the age of climate change. There's been plenty of other landscape architecture-led cities in the past. One of them is Madison, Wisconsin. And look up that history, really amazing city.
Great, and I just had maybe one more question, if you don't mind fitting it in. That for some reason I was having trouble getting it to the question in my regular feed. But many of your projects considered both community values and landscape performance metrics. Has your firm considered methods of geodesign where environmental, economic, social, and functional impacts are measured to determine a project's success?
Now, I don't want to conflate this with geoengineering, where we're talking about manipulating the climate, right? I want to separate that. That question has nothing to do with that. Can you confirm that?
Yes.
Okay, good. Just making sure. I've got my own opinions on that stuff. So I don't know a lot about geodesign. So a little out so I apologize that I don't have an exact answer, but I will address the topics within it on community metrics. And I wish I had a well-versed answer. And I actually, after this, I will learn more about geodesign. But I did touch earlier on how the community is a brain trust, but the community is an expert of their place. And for me, I think what's important is you study from the top down, the kind of ecology and how it works at the ecosystem scale, but the community can only be fed from the inside out. And what I mean by that is our current methodologies for community outreach is usually ends up where you do community outreach and you end up with the people that can afford to give you feedback, because they can come at 7 p.m. after work and show up and give you some input, and it's voluntary. And mostly those end up being what are called community brokers. And it's important when you reach out to a community to understand the power structures in a community. So one example of the power structure is in New York City, there's the community boards, right, throughout the city. And that is a top-down structure. That's the city governance reaching out to the community, but it's top-down. Then there's these self-organized structures, such as civic associations and block captains, who work from the bottom up. And so us practitioners need to understand those two forces. And working from the middle out means that you're addressing that the bottom up folks and the top down are still not giving enough signal. And that the thing that you have to do is get out to the individuals. And how do you get to the individuals? You have to go to the places of worship. You have to go to the supermarkets. You have to track them down because they can't afford to show up at your community meetings. They're a working mother with 3 kids who's barely getting food on the table. And especially in these communities of color where we mostly work in, that place in Rockaway is 70% BIPOC, right? 70%, 2/3 working class. Whereas the rest of the city, Manhattan's, investor class, totally different experience. But they can't afford to show up at these community meetings. So you have to get into their places. And that's in a very expensive lift. We have very robust budgets for that. But it's so important. And that having a Rolodex in the community also helps. But again, it doesn't get to the individuals that really give you the signal of what's really going on.
That's really great. And you basically answered a question that I had before, okay, which is how do you analyze a community where the people who you're interested in are not necessarily the ones coming forward or visible. And
if you want to read more on community structures or structures in community, we wrote about that in a book called Prospects for Resilience. And amazingly, we were asked to write with our mentor, Eric Sanderson, Adam Paris, and Bill Selecki. So there's the 3 co-authors of Prospects for Resilience. And there's a chapter that I co-wrote that you'll see in there on community structures. And it talks about just that. There's the individual, the family, there's the community, there's the neighborhood, the block and the neighborhood and the city. And there's all these scales that you have to understand where you're operating within And in order to question power is to make sure you're getting that whisper of a signal, those good ideas that are in there that are not the folks that show up in the meetings repeating themselves over and over with the same ideas, right?
And I think that is very relevant to questions about geodesign or ways of working using geographic information systems, which just by nature of what they're like tend to be literally top down. And how do you marry those two scales? And
you have to add data in. Unfortunately, with the way agencies manage their geodata, it's, like the stuff you see on the left of my background is like watershed scale city of Miami. We have a contract. We're doing 200 miles of public realm, adapting the whole city for climate change. And that's top-down watershed modeling. And then we're going to each neighborhood and building 3D models from GIS with exaggerated topo and their buildings, and then etching in the hydrology flow lines of where 1,000-year rain events are concentrating, and bringing that 3D model physically to the meetings and having people hold it and see their house and why they flood so much and all this kind of stuff. But it comes really from the inside out, where, taking the top-down data and then repackaging it in a way that they can give you feedback. Because they're experts of the place, they just don't have the expertise of us professionals, but we can be catalysts. We can see the signal that they're trying to deliver and turn that into a project that is authentic and real about their situation.
Well, I think that could be it for questions. I kind of implied that I'd let you go by 7:30 to actually get some dinner.
Nice.
But I'll let you have the last word. I guess I'll say thank you so much once again for taking this time and taking such a broad view of landscape architecture and really considering our audience of students who are thinking about these questions of what's next and how do I live in the world as a landscape architect. And I think your talk really spoke to that. So thank you, and I'll leave it for any last words from you.
Cool. Well, I will share, we're getting to a weird time in humanity where, there's all this information, all this data is of our past and our present are all collapsed in our experience. And the thing we're struggling with in manufacturing knowledge in academia at Parsons is how do you manage all this data, not just GIS data, but just information in the world in general, social media, all these things. There's all these incredible tools that are advancing so quickly. And in this noise out there, how do you find a signal? And I think one of the tools that have emerged is for everyone to figure out the relational tools that you need. So to get into a soup of data and get in there and find relations between where data intersects. And in that is where you can, what in art, what's called relational aesthetics. That in this constellation of data, those relations are critical. And not just design profession, are we struggling with, the creation of knowledge in the age of information, where there's a difference between information and knowledge. But the MFA, the Master of Fine Arts programs, are also struggling with, the knowledge economy and how do you create and so much mired data and mired misinformation that is the new, third generation of information that we're dealing with. And with that, I'll end with, I think it's an interesting time where we're in a collage of believers in science and believers in non-science, and we're living this collage of fiction and nonfiction. And I think we're gonna have to look to the arts and look to literature to know what's next, because design mostly addresses now. Science is backward, and engineering are backwards looking to establish a baseline for the present. Designers are working within, decades of time frame, but only artists are helping us understand what's happening 200 years from now, right? And that kind of thing. So that long now, we need that compass of art to get us there. And there's some incredible artists that I'm a big fan of, including Alec. When you and I met, we had Justin Bryce Borreglia, an incredible climate artist who's doing really exciting work. And I recommend you guys check him out. He's really inspired us, and we're trying to find ways to collaborate. We collaborate academically, but we want to find ways to collaborate physically on stuff. But so the answer is art.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I love leaving it there. So thanks very much, and I'll leave it to our WPSU overseers to cut the feed when they're ready. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night.